The white liberal is the one who has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor. In this political football game, the white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of The Black Radicals. In this episode, Mohammed speaks to Aurelien Mondon about his and Aaron Winter's book, Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. We chose this book carefully as it deals with one of the main issues facing left-wing politics today, which is, how do we challenge the rise of right-wing politics? How should we understand it and where does it come from? Importantly, how has the right taken control over the mainstream and what can we do about it? Professor Mondon researches and teaches the topic of reactionary politics with a focus on mainstreaming and the role played by the elite in the process. His work has focused in particular on the far and extreme right, the media, democracy, racism, populism, and transphobia. He's the co-convener of the Reactionary Politics Research Network. His book, Reactionary Democracy, is an excellent insight into the field of mainstreaming the far right. As the AfD soars in the polls, the threat of them occupying high office is starting to seem inevitable. Hopefully, this conversation helps us understand what's behind the resurgence of far-right politics and what strategies can we deploy to undercut the resurgence.
In your book, Reactionary Democracy, you start the book by investigating or interrogating this concept of how we live in a post-racial society and how basically after 1945, after Jim Crow, after apartheid South Africa, we sort of conceptualize, in the West at least, that we live in a post-racial society. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting hearing you talk about this because it feels like we wrote this book in a very different time, very different era. I don't think I would start a book now talking about post-racial societies because I think this has been widely debunked now when we look at Trump and when we look at what's happening in the European Union or in the UK. But yeah, we wrote the book in the late 2010s. It was published in 2020, and at the time we felt that there was still this kind of investment in many Western countries, and particularly in kind of white population, in this idea that racism had been defeated. So, of course, people still saw racism, but they saw racism in the exceptional, in the kind of individual acts of kind of people who were extreme, people who were bad apples, if you want, people who were kind of like pushed to the margins of society. And, it really culminated with the election, of course, of Barack Obama in the United States, the idea that, now even African Americans could be president. Of course, that didn't account for the fact that Barack Obama had various privileges he could kind of build on to kind of rise through the ranks, and that systemic racism was still very much a key part of the way the American society or US society was organized at the time, but also it also organized other kind of white societies, Western societies. So we felt that it was very important at the start to kind of debunk this idea that we did live in post-racial societies and that in fact racism remained part and parcel of the organization of our societies, which allowed then the resurgence of more kind of what we call illiberal forms of racism or reactionary politics, things that we see today playing out in terms of the calls for genocide or the defense of genocide or the construction of camps, the dehumanization of entire population, their homogenization, and so on. So we've seen this emboldening of racism, of reactionary politics, which we believe took its roots in the kind of complacency that kind of became the norm in the after-war period, and particularly in the kind of 70s, 80s, as we had the civil rights movement, the end of apartheid, the rise of kind of so-called identity politics, and so on.
I think you're right when you say the post-racial society theory has been widely debunked. And I think not just academically, and you're absolutely right when you say like we live in a time of genocide and we live in a time of basically what we're seeing in front of our eyes is just a clear depiction of like, well, what we thought of was post-racial. If we thought about this at all, it's a complete farce. Has this had any like influence in your work?
I think there are still elements of it. I think it's still gripping, in particular, the mainstream elite, the elite that's still kind of holding on to the idea that things have gone wrong all of a sudden. That 2016 was a turning point. We know with the election of Donald Trump, with the vote for Brexit in the UK, with the rise of kind of various far right parties around the EU. There's this idea that things have gone wrong, but if we could only kind of whoop this back, things would be okay again, that we were on the right track. And this has kind of like pushed me to kind of go even further back than where when Aaron and I started, really, which is instead of just looking at post-racial society and the construction of post-racial society as a way for us to not look at actually systemic forms of oppression, I went all the way back to the construction of liberalism as a bulwark against fascism. And so I went back to kind of the Second World War. I went back to the kind of like the turning point at the end of the Second World War, where the Allies started patting themselves on the back, both on the kind of Soviet side and on the kind of liberal kind of capitalist side, if you want, patting themselves on the back for having defeated evil. What Robert Meister calls, after evil, the idea that in 1945, we've defeated evil, we can move on, never again. We've learned our lesson. And what I argue here is that this has created a kind of false kind of binary between fascism and liberalism and of course really existing socialism, which has been very widely covered, of course, since people have been talking a lot about Stalinism, about kind of the gulags, about the kind of like the dangers of the way that the ideology existed under Stalin and people following Stalin. But this hasn't been done with liberalism, or not as much. Very few people have looked at what I call in the article, building on the work of others, really existing liberalism. And so what I kind of try to kind of tease out in my more recent work is the way liberalism has been kind of like held as thought of as a bulwark against fascism, that liberal institutions, liberal democracy would protect us against the resurgence of fascism. And in fact, what I argue is that it was always a potential enabler. So what I argue is that liberalism as an ideology is extremely flexible. I'm not the first one to argue that, of course. Anyone who's paid attention would see that, really. And anyone who's paid attention to the history of liberal politics in practice would know that liberalism has always been able to accommodate reactionary politics, or so-called even illiberal politics. We could think, for example, of slavery. We could think of sexism, the fact that women didn't have the right to vote, and so on. And what I argue is that a lot of the progress that we hold dear today as liberal, or as kind of like the cornerstone of liberal democracy, was in fact kind of taken from the hands of the liberal elite of the time. Whether it's workers' rights, the vote for women, all of these kind of things. So liberalism could become progressive, but it didn't always have to. Just as well, if the balance shifted, it could become reactionary. And that's what we've been seeing in the last 15 years with the mainstreaming of far-right politics. The fact that many far-right discourses have been taken up by mainstream elite actors on the center-right, on the center-left, the people who had told us they would protect us against the far-right, the people who had told us to vote for them so that they would prevent the far-right from getting into power, have ended up actually mainstreaming it and paving the way for the far-right to get into power eventually.
When the mainstream, for example, says that look over there's like the rise of the far right. Here in Germany, we have the AfD. There's reform in the UK. There's this. There's in France, which you give examples of in the book, and so on and so forth. But not actually interrogating, well, maybe not the center, but interrogating liberalism itself as not just increasingly progressive and just wants to ensure the rights be expanded to everyone. I would personally say, from like a black radical perspective, is even if you look at the works of like the liberal philosophers, this was never actually the vision. Slavery was clearly part of this vision. Savages and so on and so forth were clearly excluded. Why do you think it's not something that we take into consideration, like the link between racism, fascism, and liberalism, for example?
Well, that really has really fascinated me for quite a while. But you're absolutely right as well. This has been obvious for a very long time, right? And in fact, the tradition of black anti-fascism, I think, has been very vocal about that, and has made very clear that the roots of fascism predate fascist Italy and that or Nazi Germany, for example. So again, I think that shows this kind of like what people like Charles Mills have talked about in terms of epistemologies of ignorance. This idea that people have constructed systems of knowledge that actually allow them not to look at what's really in front of their eyes and to kind of discard it. So it's like, oh well, all of a sudden we have fascism in the 1930s. Like, where did that come from? And it's like, well, maybe it came from like the kind of trials that were put in place during the colonization period, the kind of concentration camps, the extermination, the dehumanization, all of these kind of things like came home to roost, right? But of course, there's this kind of externalization of these kind of horrible policies because they help make sense of the kind of construction of the West as a beacon of democracy, as a beacon of progress, as a beacon of human rights. And particularly in the aftermath, I think, of the Second World War. I think, I don't think it necessarily was always with ill intents that some of the leaders of the post-war period were trying to kind of rebuild their countries and kind of create some kind of sense of kind of like people coming together. But of course, that left out a lot of communities, racialized
Hmm.
communities in particular, but also queer communities and so
Hmm.
on.
Hmm.
But that also prevented these countries and these populations and these communities to actually look at the kind of deeper structures that had led to fascism, to the rise of fascism, and to the fact that most people didn't fight against fascism at the time, whether
Hmm.
within the countries that were falling for fascism, or even the countries outside that eventually ended up, defeating fascism. Many of them in the
Hmm.
1920s, 30s were quite happy to see the rise of
Hmm.
Mussolini and even Hitler, and some of them even wanted their own fascist leader. Like for example, Australia was quite keen on kind of pushing for kind of a fascist leadership at the time. Again, and the kind of end of the Second World War has prevented us from kind of really having a reckoning there, which I think builds on these kind of epistemologies of ignorance, this idea that white people in particular and white elites have constructed a history or historiography, if you want, where the West won, and guilt for fascism and Nazism is kind of like very much contained within a time period, within a particular geography, and within very few people who were bad apples and you know perverted the course of history in a way, rather than actually leading it to its logical conclusion.
I think here we're getting to what you call in the book liberal and illiberal racism. Illiberal racism basically is something that we've been told to fend off, we've been told to look out for, but there's forms of illiberal racism that still continue with us today. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and also how this has sort of was used like as a vessel to launder right-wing talking points or even right-wing parties?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's fascinating to see how quickly things have shifted in the last kind
Mhm.
of half a decade almost, really. So Aaron and I started kind of working on the idea of illiberal and liberal articulations of racism, well, almost 10 years ago now well, actually 10 years ago, yeah, 2016, 17, when we developed a framework to try to understand better the way Islamophobia was being mainstreamed in Western societies. And so we created we created the framework with these two articulations, where illiberal articulations of Islamophobia would be the ones that would be blatantly racist. So for example, throwing a pig's head at a mosque, attacking a woman wearing a hijab, physically, or saying really a very kind of extreme slur at someone who, was Muslim or looked Muslim. But what we saw at the time was that, this existed, of course, and this was widely denounced, including by far right leaders. Marine Le Pen would have denounced that at the time, for example, Nigel Farage. But what we saw at the same time was this kind of normalization of a more kind of insidious form of Islamophobia, which we called a liberal articulation of Islamophobia. So this happened through more subtle language, of course, the language of culture, the language of religion, as opposed to kind of obvious kind of racism. But it also took the form of pseudo kind of progressive, pseudo liberal arguments. So quite often it built on the idea of free speech. So if we remember the cartoons, for example, or the cartoons affair, which kind of started in Denmark at the time and then was taken up by Charlie Hebdo. This idea that we should be able to say anything we want, and of course this was always hypocritical, right? In France, for example, where Charlie Hebdo there are laws that prevent us from saying certain things. For example, Holocaust denialism is punished by law. And it's not even saying whether it's good or bad. It's just a fact. In France, there are things you cannot say. So there was never in France the idea that there is in the United States that you should be able to say absolutely everything. But somehow, when it came to Islam at the time in the 2000s, 2010s, anything went. Now, you could say absolutely anything because it was not racist, it was not Islamophobic, it was free speech. It was almost progressive, it was almost democratic and your duty. And this is the way the Charlie Hebdo attacks, which are horrible. Of course, no one should lose their lives, like for doing a cartoon or whatever. It can be denounced, can be criticized, but no one should lose their lives. I mean, that should go without saying, obviously. But then this was weaponized, this idea that you had to be Charlie, therefore you had to be Islamophobic to be pro-free speech, therefore to be pro-democracy. And in France, France was a particularly interesting case in this because there wasn't just the freedom of speech, what we also saw in the United States, in the UK, and in various other countries, which allowed Islamophobes to mainstream their Islamophobia as somewhat progressive. But in France, we also had laïcité, secularism, this idea that, in France, we, just like we don't see color, the kind of good old colorblind racism, which is incredibly prevalent in Republican France, we also don't see religion, and we don't want to see religion, and so therefore, it became a way to kind of target Muslim communities by saying that they were pushing their religion onto others. And I think what was fascinating at the time is that it allowed to split even the left, where some feminists felt that they had to choose between the fight against sexism and the fight against racism, which is that, for example, if they wanted to fight sexism and the oppression of women, therefore they needed to be a little bit racist and targeting Muslim communities who had, for example, traditions of wearing the hijab or the niqab or and so on, right? And so they felt they had to choose. But of course, this was always ridiculous, right? And many people like Christine Delphi at the time in the mid 2000s showed that this was never a choice that needed to be made. In fact, if you really want to be against sexism, you also need to be against racism. This is basic kind of intersectionality, interlocking systems of oppressions. And again, it takes us back to, tradition of Black anti-racism, Black anti-fascism, which, have been arguing this for a very, very long time now. But in France, because of this kind of color blindness and this idea that we don't talk about race because apparently we don't see race under the Republican ideal, that made it very easy to push these kind of liberal articulations of Islamophobia. So the French case is probably the most obvious one, but as I said, you could see it happening in other countries under the guise of free speech, under the guise of so-called libertarianism and the guise of political correctness, identity politics, all of these kind of things that then allowed various bad faith actors to kind of push these ideas into the mainstream. What we developed as Islamophobia, or liberal and illiberal articulations of Islamophobia, we then developed it as wider racism, looking, for example, at what happened in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, where people, for example, twisted it into like, oh, well, shouldn't it be all lives matter? And then, blue lives matter and then white lives matter, this kind of relativization, if you want, of struggles and of oppression again. And more recently, with my colleague Fran Amery at the University of Bath, we've developed it to look at transphobia as well. And what we're seeing in a way is that the same strategies are taking place everywhere. This idea that we need to kind of like, we're not racist against Islam, but we want to protect women and children. We're not against trans people, but we want to protect women and children. And it's quite fascinating, almost, where the template is kind of like applied across these kind of forms of kind of scapegoating and oppression as well. And quite often, what you see is also these groups end up joining in, for the same kind of struggles. So I think that shouldn't surprise us. What I think should surprise us is how easily our mainstream elite in the media, in politics, and in academia has fallen for that. And I think that is the most worrying part to me.
What you talk about, like free speech and something that's necessary for a democratic society, is basically used to create a threat of like an invading person who's going to come take your liberal values and all these kinds of things. Well, one of the things that you say in the book, basically, which I found quite fascinating, is mainstream in the far right is not actually something new. Can you elaborate on this a little bit and maybe give us some examples of this?
Yeah, so this is something that we've developed as well quite a bit since the book came out. So that's something that both Aaron and I were really interested in when we first met, and that's what made us kind of work together. This idea that while both of us were really interested in the extreme right, in the far right, in kind of like the more kind of like crude, if you want, racism, the more crude forms of exclusion, what we were really interested in is how these politics were starting to become increasingly mainstream, increasingly accepted in certain circles, and of course it was very different in 2016 to what it was in 2020 to what it is today. But what we could see is a trajectory, right? And so what we tried to understand really in the book first, and then in various publications since, including with Katie Brown, for example, is how ideas travel, and particularly how ideas travel from kind of being marginalized, from being taboo almost. The idea that, the far right, the extreme right, racism in any shape and form used to be taboo. Of course, as I said, it was still a structure of our society, but the most extreme forms were like beyond the pale. We would not touch them, right? And then what we started looking at is like, okay, what are these people on the far and extreme right doing to try to regain their position in the mainstream, or to try to kind of gain political power? And this is something that I looked a lot during my PhD, when I looked at the history of kind of far right politics in France, in Australia, and what I realized is that there was a conscious attempt in France in particular, with French far-right intellectuals or French extreme-right intellectuals in the 1970s, when far-right ideas were, really at the most taboo they've ever been. We had the 1968, we had kind of like a progressive wave. It was very difficult at the time to be kind of that openly racist as they wanted to, or openly fascist, or to be linked to fascism. Fascism was just bad. Everyone, felt anti-fascist, for right or wrong, because of the kind of like construction that was made out of the Second World War. And so at the time, some of these people kept trying for elections and kept struggling through kind of this kind of like old settings. But some of these intellectuals decided to kind of stop. And they decided to stop and think. And they decided, okay, how do we make our ideas mainstream? And to do that, they borrowed or they perverted the theories of Antonio Gramsci, a communist thinker who died during the fascist regime in Italy, and who had kind of like really developed the idea of the hegemonic struggle, and so they perverted it, and for them, before gaining political power, they needed to gain cultural power, and they started working at that. They started to kind of realize that they could not come back to power. They cannot come back to the mainstream using the same old templates. They could not use eugenics that as clearly as the fascists and the Nazis had done. They couldn't use the anti-Semitism of the olden days in a way. They needed to kind of like recalibrate their discourse. And so they started talking about culture instead of talking about race. And they started saying, oh, hold on, no, we're not superior to other cultures in inverted commas. We're just different. And I think it's great. We need to protect every culture. Therefore, we need to keep them separate. And you can see how shifting that discourse here from race, from direct race and superiority to different cultures appealed to a lot of liberals who didn't kind of think through, because, it was the time of the nascent multiculturalism, and people are like, oh yeah, that's true, cultures are great. But of course, for them, for the far right, the extreme right thinkers, it was always racializing. It was always about homogenization, as if there was such a thing as the French culture or the German culture or the British culture. As soon as you talk about this in homogenized terms, it is good old racism, right? But so many people fell for it. And so they started kind of gaining ground like this, trying to kind of shift the discourse without shifting the politics. And what we saw is that the more these ideas become mainstream, the more they were able to become emboldened, and the more they were able to kind of push further and further and further. And so if you look at the last 50 years, what you see is just a kind of very obvious trajectory where they're just breaking taboos one by one. They're just pushing things a bit further, a bit further. Think about, for example, great replacement theory, the idea that immigrants will come from wherever, actually, and it depends. It depends where you are. But the Great Replacement theory, of course, is very common now across far-right circles and mainstream circles to some extent. But immigrants will come and they will destroy our culture. They will destroy our nation. They will destroy our native people, whatever kind of, again, term they choose to use. This used to be incredibly taboo 20 years ago. No one would talk about it. Everyone would have been like, yeah, this is incredibly racist. Like, this is obvious racism. This is sending us to fascism. 10 years ago, people were like, oh, that's fascinating, isn't it? Like, blah, blah, blah. Legitimate concerns. The white working class is worried about immigration, even though, again, that wasn't backed up by data. And now, today, everyone talks about it, right? We get mainstream politicians talking about it. We get mainstream newspapers talking about it. And even the people who oppose that will not oppose it the way we used to 10, 20 years ago, when we used to say this is blatant fascism, this is blatant white supremacy. People will be like, oh, it's going a bit too far. And so you can see how things become mainstream slowly, right? The things that were considered taboo 10 years ago now are considered normal. And so what we're criticizing really in the book and in the work we've done since is this idea that, again, the mainstream is good, the mainstream is moderate, the mainstream is centrist, and the mainstream is almost neutral and apolitical. Well, in fact, what we're arguing is that the mainstream moves. The mainstream moves depending on actually the kind of power struggle. So it could move towards more progressive politics, but it can also move towards more reactionary politics. And right now, our mainstream is far more reactionary than the mainstream we had 10, 20 years ago, even though that mainstream was still couched in white supremacist, misogynistic, patriarchal structures, right? So it's not good.
The great replacement theory, it comes in different forms. Like there's the form of like the left behind white working class, for example. It comes in the form of like today, for example, DEIs or like equality hires, so to speak. They've gone too far. And me as a white person, I'm not white, but but me as a white person, I can't get a job anymore in the arts because like I need to be edgy. I need to either be queer. I need to either be black. I need to be a woman in order for me to give even like a placement at the university or something like this. You see these complaints all the time. It's like, oh, we're trying to replace like the white race or whatever, but it manifests in like culture. It manifests in like replacing the white working class and so on and so forth. And just one thing I wanted to ask was something that I found a little bit curious. Just like if you follow the political discourse, you see even people on the left sort of adopting these things. Why do you think that the left also sort of falls for this?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is fascinating, and it's something again we've talked about either together or in separately with Aaron and many others is how successful in a way the kind of like the counter hegemonic struggle of the far right has been that many kind of even I think left-wing voices and genuine left-wing voices have started internalizing and repeating far right discourse, not directly, of course, but kind of legitimizing it in a way, giving it ground. And again, as I said, this is not new, right? We've seen that for like the last 30 years. It started slowly, as I said, in France 20 years ago, Christine Delphi was warning about the dangers of separating what she called anti-sexist struggle and an anti-racist struggle, saying, no, we need to have both. And unfortunately, this is something that has been internalized by some chunks on the left, particularly the idea of the left behind, the white working class. And I think there's been a very kind of like lazy understanding of class. There's been a very lazy understanding of the impact of neoliberalism. And I think there's been a very lazy understanding of the last 40, 50 years of history, both economic and political, where this idea that fascism and the far right is rising because of popular demands. And what we have shown in our work is that actually, well, yes, of course, there are some serious chunks of the population, and including the working class, that do support far right politics. But A, that's nothing new. And B, actually, most of the support for these parties generally come from from people who are better off. It could be either the upper middle or upper classes, or it can be the lower middle class, which has always been the reservoir for fascist votes. In the 1930s, it was where kind of the fascist support and the Nazi support came from, and this is very similar. But unfortunately, parts of the left have fallen from this kind of narrative around which has reconstructed the working class as if the lower middle class was the working class and anyone else is not working class. And I think this is a clear mistake, because this has led to the idea that identity politics, for example, is bad, or so-called identity politics is bad, and we need to just focus on class rather than other kind of struggles, which of course is completely it plays right into the hands of reactionaries, because it splits us as opposed to putting us together. The struggle of trans people, the struggle of Muslim communities, or anyone racialized, is also the struggle of the working class, right? And can only be the struggle of a working class. You can't separate it. But it's worked very well for the far right, because a lot of kind of voices have started focusing on this so-called white working class as if it existed, which we argue in our book and in our work with Aaron and others that it doesn't. And it's just played right into their hands, because what we see as working class nowadays, and if you look at any media in the UK, in the US, is generally like older white men who may work in routine jobs, but quite often these people are actually small businessmen, right? They have their own kind of like little company, if you want, or they're all kind of like independent business. If they're in their 50s, in their 60s, they might be quite well off. They might have a working class accent. They might have been working class 40 years ago, but now they might own a house, they might own a couple of houses, they might own a couple of cars, they might have a good pension coming, they might have, some savings, all of these kind of things. And yet it's these people that we still, in our imagination, in our collective imagination, think of as working class. And while we limit the working class to these people, and I'm not saying that some people in their 60s who are white are not still working class, right? But it's not the ones we hear from generally. The ones we hear from are the kind of like guy with a white van who might have his own electrical company or something like that. But the people we don't think of when we think of a working class is the many, many people who are precarious, right? The young people who may have degrees but work in precarious jobs, which of course is becoming probably worse with AI and so on nowadays, or at least it's a fear. We're not thinking about all the racialized communities who are working in the service industry, for example, and who are keeping the city of London going, or who are keeping, like the big kind of business centers going and so on. We're not thinking about all these kind of like minorities who are exploited because again of the barriers that are thrown in front of them. Again, thinking about the trans community, I think it's fascinating that these people, whether it's young people, whether it's racialized communities, whether it's the trans community, they are quite often painted in our public discourse as elites, as if they had more rights. As you said before, this kind of backlash of like, oh, it's so hard to be a white man because all these people are demanding rights. But the thing is like these people are not demanding more rights than white people. They're demanding basic equal rights that liberalism had promised them and never gave them, or very precariously. And so I think what we need to think about when we hear left-wing people falling for these arguments of white working class left behind is we need to kind of think about it more intersectionally, thinking about the interlocking structures of oppression. If you only fight for the white working class, you are fighting for the far right, right? That's what you're doing, right? If you want to fight if you really want to fight for the genuinely white working class, then you don't need to split it from the racialized working class, from the trans working class, from, any form of working class, from young people or anything like this. So I think, yeah, it just seems so obvious to me, right? That, I mean, this is age, like this is an age-old struggle on the left, class and race. It's always been a tool of capital to split the working class. We can go back to the Civil War in the United States, the mid 19th century. As soon as slavery is abolished in the United States, segregation is put in place pretty much to kind of split the kind of newly disenfranchised African American working class with a white working class, so that they don't ally together against capital, against their bosses, against the people who exploit them. So you give a little bit more to the white working class at the time, or you give less to the kind of newly kind of like freed African American working class, so that these people don't fight together. They feel that their interests are not aligned, that their interests are in fact opposed, and that worked wonders, right, for the United States. And unfortunately, we're still falling for this idea that we should split the working class along race, along gender identity, and so on. And I think it's appalling, but yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to ask you in today's conversation, as it relates to us here in Germany, obviously, maybe 10 years ago this was the case, but today it seems to be still the case, which is the rise of the far right and this populism. I know in the UK, I think you guys have, I think is it day after tomorrow, I think you have elections where, reform is set to win a certain number of seats and so on and so forth. And we also here in Germany, the last elections that we had in where we are in Baden-Württemberg, the AfD, I think, got the second highest vote count or something like this. And I think in the book, you start to problematize this a little bit by suggesting that, well, if you look at the total count of how much they're getting, or the far right is getting, it's basically used as a scare tactic to move people towards re-voting for a useless center. Can you explain this again to us and maybe historicize it a little bit and put it into context today?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, I quite often when I write these things or when I say these things, I'm accused of like underplaying the threat the far right poses, which I don't. I've been researching the far right for 20 years. I've been an activist against the far right for longer than that. I know full well the threat that the far right poses, and that one vote for the far right is one vote too many. So the fact that I'm saying that we need to be careful with the way we read electoral results doesn't mean that I don't think that it's a worry to have even 5% of people voting for the far right. So with that caveat, all right, just in case. But what I mean is that we need to be, and it's interesting because I just published actually a short piece about that today, just ahead of the UK elections, local elections that we have on Thursday. We need to think about elections, especially on the left. We need to think about elections as not the democratic horizon we tend to think they are, right? There needs to be something else than elections in our democracies. And too often we've fallen again from what are, from my point of view, kind of reactionary talking points, which is like, well, we have an election and then we have to take the results at face value and then we need to move on, right? So, and what we're trying to argue is that, well, no, we don't. We can be more critical about that. It's like, first, how are campaigns run? Who has the right to speak? Who has access to platforms? Who has access to shaping public discourse? Who has access to shaping public opinion? Who has access to all of this, right? This is how people make their decisions. No one goes to a ballot box with a completely empty mind and decides as they look at the programs within a few minutes of voting, right? No one does that. Everyone is influenced. Even I, as someone who has been working in political science for a very long time now, I still need to rely on various sources of information to make sense of the world around me. It could be, of course, my friends, my family, the academic articles that I read and so on, but it's also the media, it's also, my workplace. So, our world is mediated. So we need to think about this first, right? When we think about electoral results. Electoral results are not the voice of the people, they're the mediated voice of the people. And it's not just even the mediated voice of the people, it's the mediated voice of the people who actually vote, which isn't necessarily all the people, right? Because a lot of people can't vote. For example, in the UK, I'm not allowed to vote in certain elections because I am not British myself. People who are under 18 are not allowed to vote. People who are, 18 and 1 day are allowed to vote. People who are 17 and 364 days are not allowed to vote, right? This is completely arbitrary, the way we organize these things.
Also, just to add, like refugees and
Of
like
course.
criminalized people and so on and so forth.
Exactly. And again, going back to the US, we know full well the impact of that, right? The impact of kind of like kicking people out of registers, or young people as well. Young people are some of the people who do not turn up to vote most. And it's not because they're lazy, it's not because they don't care about politics. It's either because they don't feel that politics represents them, or it's also because they sometimes live far away from where they registered and therefore they can't travel back because it's expensive and so on. So there's lots of reasons for why, for the many people who are not counted, right? But even if we leave aside the people who are not counted because they're foreigners, because they're criminalized, because they're refugees and so on, because they're younger, then we still get electoral results, but these electoral results are generally not complete because we don't account for the people who could vote but decide not to vote. And to some extent, that's fair enough, right? Because many of our electoral systems are based on who votes. And who wins that elections based on who votes, then wins. That's fine, whatever. These are the rules. They're arbitrary. We could debate them, but these are the rules. But on the left, that shouldn't prevent us from thinking about the people who don't vote, who could vote but don't vote. And I don't think we can put anything in their mouths. I don't think we can say, oh, they didn't vote, therefore they would have voted for the left. That's not what I'm saying at all. Maybe if they were forced to vote, they would vote for the far right. But the fact of the matter is they didn't vote. And therefore, I think we should think about that when we think about electoral results. Just to give you an example, in 2014, at the European elections, I'm talking about 2014 because I really see it as a turning point in the mainstreaming of far-right politics. We have the European elections, and they are won by the Danish People Party, a far-right party in Denmark, the Front National in France, far-right party, and UKIP in the UK, far-right party. And there's a massive hoo-ha of like, oh my God, the far right is on the rise, irresistible rise, and that's all we focus on. And in fact, for example, I think if I remember correctly, the UKIP got around 25% of the vote, I think 24% of the vote, so a quarter of the vote. So there's like massive headlines. UKIP won the elections. UKIP's on the rise. That leads to kind of David Cameron, the prime minister at the time, promising the EU referendum if he's elected, and that leads eventually to Brexit, right? But so yeah, fair enough. You know what? UKIP won the European elections with 25% of the vote. But first, European elections are second-order elections. Most people don't care about European elections because most people either don't believe the European Parliament does anything, for right or wrong, it feels too far away, and therefore quite a lot of people use that as a protest vote. Again, for right or wrong, I'm not judging the protest vote or anything like that, right? But also many people do not turn up for the European elections as well. So if you look at the massive amount of people who don't turn up, that's quite important. And so while UKIP got almost 25% of the vote, if you include abstention, the people who could have voted but didn't turn up, they actually got less than 10% of the vote. So it's 9% of the people who could have voted who led us to Brexit, who led us to the mainstreaming of far-right politics, who led us to kind of like all these kind of ongoing talks about the voice of the people being like against immigrants, being blah, 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 right? So all of this, I think, is very, very important. And it's also important when we think about who votes and who doesn't vote. In 2014, Marine Le Pen was allowed to claim that she was also the voice of the working class, saying that a third of the working class had voted for her in the 2014 EU elections. Except, as I said before, people abstain differently, right? And generally, the poorer you are or the younger you are, the more likely you are not to turn up to vote. And so the working class, by and large, shuns elections. And in 2014, it was 2/3 of the working class that didn't turn up to vote across the European Union. So when Marine Le Pen says that she gets a third of the working class vote, in fact, she gets a third of the working class vote, which means she gets 1 out of 10 working class votes. So 9 out of 10 working class people did not vote for her, and six out of 10 did not vote at all. This should tell us something about the crisis of democracy rather than the rise of the far right in and of itself. And that's what the left should focus on. And I'm just going to give you another way to kind of think about that as well. When we think about the construction of public opinion, when I've done some kind of research on the Eurobarometer, some of it I think is in the book and I've developed it since. The Eurobarometer asks people across the EU a number of dozens of questions, but there are two questions that really interest me. The first one is, according to you, what are the two biggest issues facing your country at the moment? And people can choose amongst 15 different issues. They can also choose other, they can choose their own issue, like from, environment, pensions, cost of living, terrorism, immigration, and so on and so forth. Right? And when people are asked this question about their country, immigration is quite high. It's rarely first, but it's quite high. What you can see, for example, in the UK, which is fascinating, is that it spikes in 2016 and then it falls like dramatically, which is fascinating because actually immigration kept rising in the years after Brexit was voted, right? So you can see already a disconnect. It's like, why were people so worried about immigration in 2016 and then they're not worried anymore, even though we get almost twice as many migrants? And we see the same thing in Germany, by the way. We see a massive spike, of course, in 2015-16 with the so-called refugee crisis, and then it kind of goes away, even though, the refugees are still here. And, so there's something fascinating there. But what's even more fascinating is that the Eurobarometer, as opposed to Ipsos, YouGov, and so on, what they do is they ask a follow-up question. And they say, according to you personally, what are the two biggest issues you are facing at the moment? And the same people, within a couple of minutes, who had put immigration quite high, don't care anymore. Immigration doesn't reach 10%. People are like, I care about cost of living. I care about health. I care about pensions. I care about education. I care about salaries. I care about blah, blah, blah. But of course they do, right? Of course they do. Because when you look at your life, generally you don't think about the immigrant next door. You think about, oh, am I going to make rent this month? Am I going to lose my job? Are my children going to get a better deal than I did? And the immigrant all of a sudden is the person struggling just as much as you are, as the person who's working at the supermarket, at the pharmacy, at the shop, whatever. They're your neighbor. They're the people living around you, or they're not there at all, which is because like there are areas, for example, in the UK, in France, in the EU, where there's this very strong anti-immigrant sentiment, even though there's no immigrants, right? So we see that quite a lot. So we need to think about the way our knowledge of the world is constructed. And that's why we need to take electoral results with a grain of salt. We always need to think about turnout. We always need to think about which issues are key to media discourses, what is platformed, what is not, whose voices are heard, whose are not. Who is represented as the people and who isn't.
When you say, for example, you see how like a very small minority of a minority have managed to use like a lightning rod of like immigration or whatever it is to catapult basically the question of like Brexit and actually succeed, quite frankly. You mentioned that the center is somewhat fluid, is contingent. At least for us, or for me personally, I'm born in 92. The center has always moved to the right. It seems it has never moved to the left. I would just ask, do you think that it can ever be pushed to the left? Do you think like there's an inherent sort of gravitational force towards like fascism, gravitational force towards this? Just simply because we really haven't seen, we moved from like the dot-com crash to like the 2007 to like COVID to I don't know, the genocide today, and it's just you think it's gonna get, you think it's the worst it's ever been, and then the next year there's something new, like just for us as like youngsters and even people who are younger than I, we haven't seen that, what can we make of this?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, you're absolutely right, and in a way, I almost feel responsible because I feel like the last time it moved to the left was the year I was born, and then and it started moving to the right. So maybe it's my fault. I don't know. But yeah, no, I mean, but I don't think we should be surprised, and I don't think it's inevitable either. I think, first, not everything has moved to the right at the same pace. Not everything has moved to the right even. We have made some progress even in the last, 30 years, 35 years, 40 years. We've made some progress in terms of, I think the population by and large has actually made a lot of progress in many countries. Think, for example, about LGBTQ plus, not necessarily rights, because of course we're seeing them now being removed, and we're seeing, like various communities being excluded. But I think attitudes wise, I think things have changed dramatically. And for example, with kind of younger generation, Gen Z or Gen Alpha, I think there's kind of some real kind of potential here. So I think people have changed, and I think there's been progress there. I think it hasn't followed in our kind of elite circles, because I think what we are heading towards is, I think what we've been into is a crisis of a capitalist system, or many crises of a capitalist system. We have also the polycrisis. So like the crisis to the capitalist system and the way our societies are organized, I think are kind of like piling up. And what are kind of what the elite that has vested interest in the capitalist system to continue, what they find to make sure that it does continue is find scapegoats, right? They divert our attention onto either yeah, as I said, scapegoats, folk devils, moral panics, the idea that somehow what we should worry about right now is not the cost of living crisis, but trans people, right? This is ridiculous, completely. Or what we should worry about is young girls wearing hijabs. Again, ridiculous, as if that was the threat to women in France, or in the UK, or in Germany, or the US, or whatever. Think, for example, of Donald Trump and the way he talked about Haitian migrants, eating dogs. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's completely bonkers, and yet that kind of like, I don't think many people necessarily buy it, but that creates a distraction away from actually what people care about and what people should think about when they go voting. And what that does is that it's not just the far right doing that, it's also kind of the mainstream elite, because the mainstream elite doesn't have any answers to the many crises we are facing, because they're unwilling to even consider the radical changes that would be needed to address the many crises we are facing, because that would mean actually changing our kind of economic system quite radically. And they're refusing to do that. We're seeing this, for example, in the UK right now with Keir Starmer, who's nominally a center-left prime minister, and everything he's been doing has been to try to protect the current kind of settlement we have, which is clearly not working for anyone, but somehow is willing to do that, even if it's at the cost of kind of mainstreaming far-right politics. So what we have is, we have, of course, the far right using moral panics to kind of divert attention onto scapegoats that kind of serve their interest. But then you have mainstream actors then using the far right as a threat, almost as a stick, which is either you stay with us and you vote for us, and that goes back to what you were saying earlier, either you stay with us and you vote for us, or you get worse, right? And so that's what Lorna Finlayson has called lesser revilism. The idea that now when we vote for the lesser of two evils. We don't like what we vote for, but we're worried that if we don't vote for what we vote for, we might get worse. And this is exactly what happened in 2024 in the United States. This idea that American citizens were asked to vote for Biden or Kamala Harris, regardless of what they'd been doing with Gaza, right? So they'd been enabling a genocide, and yet people were made to feel guilty for not voting for Biden first and then Harris when she replaced him. And still to this day, you still hear people blaming the left for Harris losing. And it's like, okay, I'm sorry, but like maybe there's something else there that's happening. And maybe we should stop having to vote for things we believe are not just what we want. It's not just what we want. It's not just a question of idealism on the left or anything like that. But it's actually bad. If you look at what's happening with Starmer today, he has done nothing better than what the Tories have done. And even if he's done a couple of things maybe that are a bit better than what the Tories have done, he's done a lot of things that actually have gone further than what the Tories had done before him. So,
Sure.
so I think I think progress is not, sorry, it's kind of like a big digression, but I think this kind of reactionary trend is not inevitable, but I think it necessitates us to separate what our mainstream elite is doing to what we should be offering as a left alternative. And what I mean I don't just talk about parties. Again, I talk about democracy more widely, right? And I think it doesn't mean that we need to stop voting or anything like that. Again, like I'd rather have Kamala Harris rather than Donald Trump, of course, in 2024. I'd rather have whatever kind of centrist Macronist next year in France than Marine Le Pen, or I'd rather have Starmer than Farage, although right now I'm wondering, because honestly, I'm not sure what else he could do that Starmer is not doing. But we need to think beyond that. And also, we can't allow them to have our loyalty. Like, we cannot be loyal to these people who are actually undermining our democracies, who are throwing countless communities under the bus. I think, the good old kind of slogan of an injury to one is an injury to all. I think that's what we need to stick with, right? And that's why, I keep going back to this kind of idea of radical intersectionality and, interlocking systems of oppressions. We cannot allow any community to be thrown under the bus for the sake of protecting whatever interests we think are good for us, right?
Like to play the devil's advocate. Okay. So the
Hmm.
situation in Germany is as or I think as I see it, or but I think in reality is as such. We have like the SD, CDU, for example, the Christian Democrats, and constantly we're hearing about the threats of the AfD and how they're going to come to office and do this and do that. We also had a person on Lawrence Stokes on the podcast previously. And basically, what you see historically and today is that there is not too much difference between the policies of the CDU, and especially in some different regions in Germany, it's more severe and so on and so forth. Like, for example, there's a state in Germany where if you say, for example, certain pro-Palestinian phrases, you can get up to 5 years. And it's already been implemented that you need to support Israel in order for you to get like there's just like really really bonkers stuff, and that's beyond the fact that the states like slashes your benefits, and that's beyond like so many different things. It seems right now that the far right and let's say the quote unquote the mainstream. I mean, today I think the Christian Democrats in Germany is the biggest party in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, or the second biggest party in Germany. They sort of eclipse Lawrence Stokes, says that the rhetoric that's being used today by the AfD is no different than the rhetoric if you
Hmm.
go back of how it's been used basically to like describe guest workers and migrants who come to Germany and so on and so forth. You mentioned, for example, like maybe in gist, like what Starmer can do that that Nigel Farage wouldn't, you know what I mean? Or vice versa, sorry. And I'm just wondering, okay, electorally we have very limited options. I agree with you that we have to do, and this is one of the reasons why we have the black radicals, but we have to do things that are extra parliamentary or extra electorally. But at one point, do we say enough is enough? Is
Hmm.
my question to you.
Look, I mean, that's a great question, right? And I think I said that personally 20, well, actually, I can tell you exactly when I said that personally. It was, I think it was the 2nd of May, 2002.
Okay.
Yeah, it's so the first time I ever voted or the first time I ever voted for a kind of major election was in 2002 in France for the presidential election. And I was young, obviously, at the time. But I was worried that Le Pen, Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's father, who was a Holocaust denier, who had been supporting the Vichy regime, who
Mm,
yeah, who was like a really kind of like extreme kind of like candidate. I was worried that he would get to the second round. And it was kind of an irrational fear, but I kind of felt it, in somehow in my bones, and so I ended up voting for the center-left candidate, Lionel Jospin at the time. Even though I did not want to vote for him, I was kind of worried that he would get through. And interestingly, I remember telling my parents, who had always been kind of center-left voters, to vote for the center-left, and they were like, "No, we've had enough. We don't like him. He's been prime minister for 5 years." And so we had a right-wing president, Jacques Chirac. We had a prime minister who was part of the Socialist Party, Lionel Jospin. And my parents
mm,
were like, "No, we'll vote for someone else." And anyway, it's a done deal. We'll vote for him in the second round. Second round is going to be center-left versus center-right, as always. Blah blah blah. And of course not. What happens is Jean-Marie Le Pen gets to the second round. The center-left candidate is kicked out. So we have a choice in the second round between the right-wing candidate, Jacques Chirac, who is embroiled in countless corruption scandals, who's the kind of who went through the first round with 11.5% of the registered votes, so received just over 10% of a registered vote in the first round, and ends up being elected with 82% of the vote in the second round, right? Dictator style. So
crazy.
it's right, it's mad, right? And I voted for him in the second round, right?
Okay.
People went to vote for him with pegs on their nose, with gloves, because they knew he was a crook, they knew he was like, they didn't like his politics, he was really right wing. Uh, but people voted for him because everyone was so scared that the far right would get into power. All
Mm,
of the media, had on their front page, the bomb, the shock, the earthquake, for the republic, we need to vote for democracy, we need to blah, 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 right? There's this idea that, oh my God, fascism is at the door. And as I said, I voted for Chirac in the second round, right? And then when I had the opportunity to kind of do some studies and think about it a bit more and meet maybe the right people, I mean, I would hope so at least, and read the right things, I started and being able to move away from France as well, and kind of gave me a different kind of appreciation of kind of French politics, French history, and so on, and made me kind of like confront the way I'd been raised as well, thinking about the Republic and colorblindness and many other things, which I think came together in this kind of reassessment of what had happened in 2002 when I ended up voting for Jacques Chirac, where I realized that actually, first thing, the far right was never at the door. There was never
Mm.
a chance in hell that Jean-Marie Le Pen would win that second round, whether I voted or not, right? At the time, Jean-Marie Le Pen, in fact, had been stagnating. So he got pretty much as many votes as he got in 1995 and as he got in
Wow.
1988. So over
Yeah.
15 years, Jean-Marie Le Pen doesn't increase his share of the vote. What
Mm.
happens is the mainstream parties collapse. In
Mm.
2002, the center left, the center right, and the center get as many votes as people who do not turn up to vote, which is insane,
Wow.
right? The parties
Wow.
that had been leading us since the Second World War did not appeal to more than a third of the electorate anymore in the first round because people were
Just
fed up.
because
Yep, go
this, I
ahead.
think, is a so important point. I'd like just to contextualize it. You're saying basically that the main parties who have led the quote unquote the post-war democracies
Mhm.
have gotten less votes than the people sitting at home and not voting.
Pretty much. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
then
Yeah. Yeah.
you have like a split. Lots of people go for more radical left parties. Some people go from other right-wing parties, and the same amount of people, or the same share of people, go for the Front National as they did 7 years prior or 14 years prior. So what happens is not the far right rising in 2002. It's the mainstream parties completely collapsing. It's the
Hmm.
fact that the second biggest mainstream party cannot get more than 11% of the registered vote in the
Wow.
first round, right?
Oh, wow.
And so as I was thinking about this, I realized, and so this is only the start of the story. It's already made me feel like, okay, this system is really so problematic. And
Mm.
then Jacques Chirac gets elected on the promise that he's elected to fight the far right and he will be the bulwark against the far right and makes these grand speeches about how he's a Gaullist and blah, blah, blah. And then he puts as his Home Secretary, Minister of the Interior, Nicolas Sarkozy, who is
Oh.
so-called hard right, I would call him far right, kind of minister, who then will become president in 2007, who will play a key part in mainstreaming much of the discourse, the Islamophobic discourse in particular of the Front National. And so, Jacques Chirac getting elected with 82% of the vote to be a bulwark against the far right ends up opening the gates.
Mm.
So, I mean, it's a very long kind of like anecdote to tell you that, yeah, I mean, look, for 25 years now, I've lost faith in that system, and I've seen it happen in many other cases. I've seen it happen in France every 5 years, pretty much. Every time we have a presidential election, we've seen it with Macron, but we've seen it in the UK with Starmer. I think you've seen it in Germany as well. We've seen it
Mhm.
in Denmark with the Social Democrats recently, in the US with the Democrats as well. And but it's not for me to tell people what to do, right? At the end of the day, personally, I think I totally understand why people still want to kind of still have that fear that and also we can see it. I think things are a lot worse in the US under Trump than they would have been under Kamala
Mhm.
Harris. Would they have been better under Kamala Harris than they were under Biden? Probably not, right? I'm not saying we wouldn't have moved further right. We might have, we might not have. I don't know. It's rewriting history. What I'm saying is that I understand why people would want to still vote for the lesser of two evil, and I'm not going to blame them for that. Just as much as I'm not going to blame the people who don't want to do that either, because I totally understand why they wouldn't do that. What I would blame, though, people for is not doing anything else, right? Because, as I
Mhm.
said, we are, uh, I don't think this is irreversible, right? I don't
Mhm.
think reactionary politics are on the rise. I don't think they are that popular. I think they are becoming increasingly internalized by people because the more you hear that migrants are afraid, the more you are likely to believe it. The more you hear that trans people are afraid to women, if you've never met a trans person and if you're not a woman, yeah, you might believe it as well, right?
Mhm.
Um, the more you hear these things, the more you internalize them. So yeah, I think there's a growing kind of popularity of the far right, but I think by and large they are still very unpopular, and by and large people care about other things as well. I think if we talk to people about the impact of climate change, if we talk to people about cost of living, if we talk to people about pensions, about education, about children, about their grandparents, I think people would care far more about that than they would care about 0.1% of the population or immigrants or Muslims or anything like this, right? I think that's why I think what I want people to think in a way, or to kind of try to do through my work, is to kind of like expand our understanding of democracy, because we've become stuck in the idea that only elections matter. And
Mhm.
elections are at best a part of democracy, and in fact, according to various thinkers, not even democratic at all.
Mhm.
So I think we need to think beyond elections. If people want to vote, that's fine. I totally understand why they would. But it can't just be that. If we're serious about the rise of fascism, we need to work with communities, we need to work with the grassroots, we need to work on our media ecosystems. We need kind of like a holistic approach, if you want. It can't just be working on the streets of our hometown. It has to take a bigger vision of how knowledge is mediated and so on. We can't all do everything, of course, right?
Mhm.
But that's why we need to kind of like focus on where we can do most, we can enact most change, but then work in coalitions as well and work together and always keep in mind, again, these kind of interlocking systems of oppressions that I was talking about before.
I have one last question, if you don't mind, but this is, I think, a very hopeful point, and it's a question just to pick up on what you just said. I think you said that you don't blame people for not voting, and you don't blame people for voting for the lesser two evil, but you do blame people for doing nothing. And I think this sounds to me like a wise or a reasonable thing, right? Because obviously we are facing income inequality, we're facing like social justice issues, we're facing a genocide, we're facing benefit cuts, we're facing like disabilities cuts, we're facing increased racialization of society, criminalization of society, surveillance technologies being, all these kinds of things. Everyone or the working class is shafted, you know what I mean? We need to consider like electoral politics a little bit secondary, and we need to do things differently. Not to put you on the spot, but can you give us like a blueprint of what that looks like? Because I think one of the hopeful experiments when it first came out was your party in the UK. For listeners in Germany, your party in the UK was a political party started by two socialists who hated each other, funnily enough. Um, and initially, the party got something, well, like, obviously these things should be taken with a pinch of salt, got like 800,000 pledges or members or however you want to see it. It looked like it was a viable new alternative to the current system or the current like mainstream systems and so on and so forth. A party that outwardly called itself like or tried to call itself like a socialist party. For those who are not familiar with the story, it basically crashed and burned. And so the reason why I bring this example up is because they tried to experiment even radically in electoral politics. It failed. This doesn't mean that electoral politics, radical experimentation with it is like is inevitably going to fail. But what lessons can we learn from the British experience? And also what would you suggest for us to do extra parliamentarily or extra electorally?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and yeah, the Your Party example is a very interesting one. I mean, I'd like to qualify what I said before when I say, I blame the people for doing nothing. I don't really blame the people who are, like trying to make ends meet at the end of a month and who are, like struggling. What I blame really is the people who could do something who are doing nothing. And that's why a lot of my work has been on the mainstream elite, the people who pretend that they're against the far right, but end up actually either doing nothing or actually mainstreaming far right politics, and I talk about the kind of some left-wing parties. I talk about the so-called left-wing media and how they're all playing in the hands of the far right. So they're really the people that I blame. And I think that's part of, in a way, one of a kind of multi-pronged approach to what we need to do right now to counter the reactionary tide, but also to kind of address the polycrisis is, something like your party showed us that there's clear appetite for a different world. There's clear appetite for a world that is more just, that is fairer. But it's not just your party that has shown us that. It's also the mass demonstrations that we have seen in the last few years, but also we could say the last 50 years, every time something happens, right? But, the million people in London, for example, demonstrating against the genocide, the people demonstrating for against like the No Kings demonstration in the United States and in various other places as well. There were some big demonstrations in Germany, if I remember correctly, last year, maybe against the AfD as well. I mean, I know it fizzled out, but I think there is appetite. People want something different, but they don't know how to necessarily where to put their kind of like energy. Your party seemed like it could have worked like that. I think there were more than 700,000 people who signed up for the mailing list when it was first announced. Then, as you said, it crashed and burned. I don't think it only crashed and burned because the system took it down. I think they took themselves down. Personally, I think they were poorly prepared. I think what we've seen in electoral politics in the UK that I think has been very interesting is the rise of the Greens Party, particularly under the leadership of Zach Polensky. And regardless, and again, of a wider political project, I think, having discussed that with various colleagues, what has been very interesting with the Greens and their campaigning so far is that are one of the first kind of successful electoral campaign in my mind that has managed to kind of move the heat away from the far right's pet issues. And I think again it shows that it is possible to at least shift the discourse. Even if Polanski doesn't win, even if the Greens don't have the best agenda, at least what they're doing is shifting the discussion away from immigration, refugees, asylum seekers, trans people onto cost of living, onto the environment, onto things that actually anyone to the left of the Greens has no answer to. And even though that's what people really care about. And I think that's important because, again, whether we like the Greens or not, it creates space for people on the left to then talk about these issues without having to always go back to like, but what about immigration? So now we can talk about things that actually are fruitful for us as opposed to always having to debunk to kind of like counter misinformation, whatever. And I think this is something we need to do. We need to create these spaces where we talk about what is good for the left, right? What is good for the left in terms of popularity, in terms of electoral ability, but also in terms of like moving our projects forwards. At the moment, we are always on the back foot, right? Of course, we have to be, but at the moment, what we're doing on the left is reacting to reaction. So yeah, we are on the street fighting fascists, and it has to be done. We are demonstrating against the far right. We are demonstrating against genocide. All of this needs to be done, 100%. But it can't just be that. We also need to have a blueprint for a future. We also need to have. It doesn't have to be perfect, the blueprint. It doesn't have to kind of tell us exactly all the ins and outs, but we need to have a new horizon. We need to think. And this is what, going back to our earlier discussion, this is what far right intellectuals did in the 1970s. They took their time, and I know we don't have a time at the moment on the left in particular, but they took their time and they were like, okay, how do we get to power? How do we bring our ideas to the mainstream? How do we force our ideas to become common sense? So it needs this kind of multi-pronged approach from, to some extent, I think electoral politics are important there. And I think what your party was trying to do was probably a good thing. I think it, unfortunately, it crashed and burned, as you said. What the Greens are doing, I think, is useful. Again, whether, regardless of, whether we think the Greens are the future or the kind of blueprint for what we want, I think what they're doing is shifting kind of that discourse. I mean, I think that's important. But I think we need to also kind of focus on community grassroots, developing kind of new ways of kind of like creating solidarity. And we finally need to focus on accountability and mediation. So, we need to kind of make our mainstream elite accountable as much as we can, which is, of course, difficult because they don't care. And they live in a bubble, but that's what I try to do with a kind of little bit of kind of epistemic privilege that I have as an academic. I call out people as much as I can, people in positions of power, including academics, including people like myself. We have a responsibility when we have a platform. When, for example, I have a platform with you today, and I'm grateful for that. And I could just tell you that everything is fine and that actually we need to keep things going and I just need a pay rise. But also I could say that academia, the way it is working today, is just not working, and we're not taking responsibility for our actions, to be honest. And I think we should do more as academics, the same as journalists. Not journalists. I won't blame journalists because journalists are really struggling at the moment. But I think they could act more ethically in various places, partly the ones who are in senior positions of power, again, editorial boards and so on. I think we need to think more carefully about who we support, who we promote, who we give money to, and so on when it comes to the media. And yeah, we need to hold these people to account. We need to, we need more transparency. We need more accountability. We have a blueprint for a better future, right? Lots of people have been kind of talking about this, researching this, telling us what we need to have a proper democracy. We know what we need, right? We're just not doing. Oh, we are doing it, but the people who have most power are refusing to, and instead they're just like, turning the heat on scapegoats on people who are already marginalized, people who are already oppressed. Yeah, and splitting us. So yeah, multi-pronged approach. But yeah, look, I try to remain optimistic. I don't think we are in a good place. I don't think we're heading into a good place. But what keeps me slightly optimistic is that it doesn't have to be this way, and that most people don't want it to be this way. Uh, you know, it might still be this way because power is not with us necessarily, but I think we still can do something.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think like at least it's a good note to end with, and hopefully it's a long road, but I think what's the alternative to falter to like fascism? No, thank you.
Yeah.
But yeah, with that, thank you for coming on and sharing your thoughts, and even though it's bleak, but giving us some answers and some hope, and hopefully we can have you on again to talk about elections and talk about like what we can do democratically and so on and so forth.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.